have a right to be able to work and raise families and get on and off the bus and on and off trains like everybody else.
We need a death penalty. We don't want one. We need one.
The act has the potential to become one of the great civil rights laws of our generation.
The Senate is passing. The President has endorsed it. Our time has come. Pass this bill now.
Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down.
I think in the 50s, people didn't even consider themselves a minority group. They didn't even think of disability rights as two words that went together. It was really extraordinary. My vocational rehabilitation counselor came in and talked to me for a while. His recommendation was that I go to a sheltered workshop to spend my life making baskets.
There was a belief that if you had a disability, you didn't have any desire to live a life. You didn't have the goals and the dreams that somebody non-disabled had.
For those of us who had physical disabilities like myself, there was not an ability to be freely moving around the community like my peers. Houses were not accessible. I was unable to go to the local neighborhood school. There were steps, and the principal wouldn't allow me to go to school.
One of the memories that I still have, and I will always have, is being at public events, like an auto show, where the March of Dimes would have a booth, and I would be there on display. Little, tiny, blonde-haired, crippled kid sitting in a great big wheelchair that was way too big for me, and remembering that people would look at me and just look horrified and pull out money and put it in the container because they didn't want this to happen to their kid. There were many stereotypes, many myths, and many fears about something different. There were fears about people who weren't, quote, normal. That's a word that I grew up hating because you always heard about the handicapped kids and the normal kids, and they create enormous barriers. So many military people were coming back disabled. And we looked at that in a different way than we did, say, somebody who had been disabled from birth or disabled as a child. These were our heroes.
I want to extend a hearty welcome to all of you on your return to the United States.
And now they had this disability. We didn't write them off as no longer of any value. We didn't decide that their lives were over. We gave them hospitals where they could be treated, where they could be rehabilitated. We gave them the opportunity to go to school. We gave them the opportunity to build their lives. We provided benefits. What caught on is everybody looking at that and saying, wait a minute, this is how it should be for all people with disabilities. People in our generation, as we were coming of age, didn't believe the myths and the stereotypes and didn't believe we should be denied access to anything we wanted to do, Look at Ed Roberts.
Ed Roberts is a guy who had polio, and he had a mother who was a tenacious advocate. And so she lobbied for him to be able to go to high school with everyone else, even though he slept in an iron lung at night. They weren't going to let him graduate from high school because he hadn't fulfilled the physical education requirement. So she took it all the way up to the State Department of Education before he could get his high school diploma. And then he wanted to go to University of California at Berkeley, and he was told, oh, we had another wheelchair guy here one time and it didn't work out. So they weren't going to let him into college. They got Berkeley to agree to admit him, and the only way they would agree to admit him was if, instead of housing him in a dorm, he was housed in the infirmary.
Ed fully believed that he could do whatever he wanted to do in spite of what everybody said to him.
The Disabled Students Program was started in the 1960s by Ed Roberts and a number of other significantly disabled people who were going to the university but needed more supports in order to be able to be successful. They needed assistance in finding attendance, learning about federal benefits that they might be eligible for. They wanted to be able to live independently in the community.
People used to ask John F. Kennedy how he became a war hero, and he said it was easy, they sank my boat. So when people ask me how I got involved in this, I say, well, it was easy. I got committed to a mental hospital. And as soon as that happened to me, I had this very powerful conviction that something was fundamentally wrong. A lot of medication. Everybody was on medication. And the drugs make you feel very weird, physically not at home in your own body. Very unpleasant feelings. And when you complained about that, instead of somebody saying, oh, well, that's a side effect of the drugs, they would say, well, that's your illness. And they would usually give you more drugs. Essentially, you had no rights at all. You were totally at the mercy of the people who ran the show, who were basically untrained aides. But here was this other system that you didn't have to break any laws and you didn't have to be convicted of anything. You just had to have a doctor say you were crazy and they could take away your freedom.
It was the same all across the country. I just saw lives being wasted and people being abused. Patients arriving in the middle of the night with no medical records, and they were dead by the next morning because they hadn't transferred the basic medical information on what medications the patient needed.
I visited the State Institution for the Mentally Retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth. But many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions.
I knew a lot about developmental services. I knew a lot about developmental disabilities. So I went to Willowbrook. I figured, well, go serve in hell and see what you can do. What I saw moved me to tears. I used to come home and I became aware of how bad I smelled when I came home because the place smelled bad. And I would come in to my home with my children and my wife, and I had my white coat on, and I was sort of like a fisherman coming in, like from a day's work in the ocean, you smell like fish. And I smelled like the institution. This place has got to be cleaned up. Geraldo Rivera came with his crew. We had the keys to everything, access to everything. And so we took Geraldo and showed him what our day-to-day normal thing was.
The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. These patients do have clothes on today, but as you can see, the one thing that can't be hidden is that there are no training programs, that all these patients do is sit during the day.
They're stuck there, and they didn't belong there. They didn't want to be there, and we wanted them free.
Close them all. Don't fix them. And we went to court.
Legal action actually is good. It brings about change, but it disempowers people. You know, let the lawyers do it. So what am I doing? What am I sitting there? A piece of chopped liver? You know, I'm going to let the lawyer do it. What do I do? If we're going to get something, we have to be out there and really fight for it.
When the disability movement first got started, it was kind of, you know, blind people with other blind people, or deaf people with other deaf people, or wheelchair users with other wheelchair users, or people with psychiatric diagnoses with other. But gradually we realized that while each of us had individual issues based on our disability, there were many, many more overarching issues, and we were going to be much more powerful if we worked across the different disabilities. Being together in the spirit of righteous anger with your brothers and sisters all fighting for the same thing.
Independent meant that Ed would choose the people who would work for him. He would choose when to go to bed and when to get up and what to wear and what to eat and where to go. That's being independent, and that's the opposite of being in an institution where they're putting you to bed at a certain time. You get up, you eat what they provide, and you have very little say about any of this. It's a powerful concept.
We have severely disabled people, hundreds, living scattered around the community. People are integrated socially as well as economically into the city.
What you need is an attendant to come and get you up in the morning. Okay. And anything you need, we're here.
Ed was a force within himself. He was the best poster child you can have. Sticking that microphone into Eddie's mouth while he's laying in his iron lung, it's like blew people's minds. Sometimes, in order to get somebody's attention, you have to hit him across the head with a 2x4. And Eddie was the 2x4 of the community.
Anyone that wants to, and anyone that needs a little help, can live in the community, not in an institution. It's an integrated future.
We hear that term, independent living center, and they don't know what it is. They think it's like some kind of residential place, but it's not. It's a place that provides services that are peer-based. That is, the counseling is given by people who have disabilities, and it provides certain core services like advocacy, benefits counseling.
It was an empowering organization. It was disabled people coming together who believed that we could transform the world. And I think that was one of the very exciting parts about the development of the Centers for Independent Living across the United States.
I'm independent, I can get dressed, I can drive a hand-controlled car and so on, but I'm really a backdoor citizen or a second-class citizen when it comes to getting into the buildings my taxes pay for.
Downtown DC, every single corner had a curb and no ramp. And it was like the Berlin Wall at every corner for somebody in a wheelchair. It just was virtually impossible to get around. It appalled me to see our nation's capital so inaccessible.
Here we take money from the general population. We then build buildings that exclude, because we build them with barriers, a portion of the population that's paying for these buildings and that should have access to the buildings. Congress worked out what became the first civil rights law for people with disabilities, the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. Buildings that were built with federal funds should be built in an accessible manner.
It didn't have enforcement. There was no enforcement mechanism. And it was a good idea. It was very exciting, and to take nothing away from the people who, at that time, that may have been as far as it could go. I want to see the results, and I want to see things change. And the only way you're going to have change is to have enforcement of the laws. When I drafted the House bill, I included independent living and most severe persons with disabilities.
At that time, we looked at it as the civil rights bill because it's all we had. But because it was limited to only entities that were funded with federal money, it wasn't really our Civil Rights Act, but it was a big step.
It was clear that this was social change on a very large scale. And so that's not easy for people to grasp or understand. There was resistance to the idea that discrimination should be more than just treating people who are, just treating them all the same. There was resistance to the breadth of the definition of disability.
And Nixon had the nerve to veto it.
We got 2 vetoes, so it was very unusual. I mean, we had a real battle going.
At that time, in the early 70s, we had learned from what was going on in the women's movement, in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, in the aging movement. We had to band together as a community to articulate a vision. And so we looked for lots of different opportunities where we could do things to get our message in the public eyes. People were coming together to express the outrage of this bill being vetoed. Nixon was beginning to have problems politically. Problems were escalating. I think it was the momentum of many different things which resulted in him finally signing the legislation.
I did not want to be identified as a disability advocate, but I do think that there's a purpose and a reason for being here, and that we aren't always in control of that. I've often thought that I was given that opportunity, and I am so happy I was, because I feel like I've hopefully helped to make things a little better.
I will sign a set of 504 regulations by early May.
Now
I will do The last administration took 2.5 years and decided not to move. I've had 2.5 months.
People with disabilities felt this law was passed in 73. Here it was 77. The implementing regulations had not been done. The only way we are going to get our rights is to make people understand that they mean something to us, and we're going to make sure that they're enforced.
We've been moving on them for 4 years, and the regs still hadn't come out. We weren't going to wait any longer.
And we were targeting all 10 of the regional buildings of what was then HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare.
One of the problems which we face is that everybody does want to treat us separately and differently now. And as far as we're concerned, that's the essence of discrimination. So in reviewing these, will you review that particular aspect of them for the blind at least?
I will review that particular aspect of them for all the handicapped.
I think Secretary Califano took it personally that they weren't giving him the time to make a reasoned decision. He was going to consider them carefully. How dare these people just say, sign this now?
Title V of the Rehabilitation Act had 5 provisions, one of which is Section 504. And 504 says any entity receiving money from the federal government may not discriminate against one based on disability. So it was a very expansive provision. It covers primary, secondary, higher education. It covers universities. It covers healthcare institutions. It covers any entity getting money from the federal government.
This nation has to get prepared for a major change, a mini revolution, if you will, in the lifestyles of federal beneficiaries, which will be clear when those regulations are ultimately completed and made public.
We believed that if they dragged this process on, the rules would change, and we were unwilling to allow that to happen.
Now, those of us in Berkeley, when you talk demonstration to Berkeleyites, I mean, we knew how to organize a protest. And so we did.
Handicapped started invading the building. It's the old federal building, which is now the...
I remember it. They were ready for us, kind of like with tea and lemonade and cookies. I think that we were viewed as old children. This is not why we're here.
Well, there's an illegal demonstration going on in San Francisco, and I just don't think it's appropriate to do that.
I understand you agreed to meet with them at Camp Scott. Is that true?
They had taken over the federal building in San Francisco. And we were under the gun to do things quickly, to make this stop, make it go away.
For some, this was the first time that they had ever defied, even in a minor way, defied the rules. And that was like a drug. It was invigorating.
It's the first really militant thing that disabled people have ever done. And we want people to listen to us. We have tried negotiations, they do not work, and at this point, we are non-negotiable. We want those regulations signed.
There wasn't backlash coming in against what we were doing. You didn't have citizen groups writing to the president or to Califano saying, get these people out of here, we don't want, we want you to make the changes that you want to make. None of that was happening. The day that the hearings were being held was, for me, very emotional because we were tired, we'd been working really hard, and finally we're getting some form of a formal congressional hearing.
The point that needs to be made is that we will not leave the building until the regulations are signed as we want, or unless we believe that the actions that we're taking here and on the outside are not producing what we need.
The demonstrators outside say they will be here every day to show their support. Rick Davis, NBC News.
We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation. We will accept no more discussion of segregation. And I would appreciate it if you would stop shaking your head in agreement when I don't think you understand what we are talking about.
One day, a paper came from Paris. Another day, TASS from the Soviet Union was there. It was certainly the first time that we ever saw not only national but international media beginning to pay attention to this issue of these freaks doing something that they never thought we could do, let alone have a political agenda.
It was a time for applause and smiles at the San Francisco offices of HEW. The handicapped have occupied this building for 22 days, demanding that Secretary Califano sign...
He called us up to his office. There were like 5 or 6 people in the room. And he signed the regulation. I've had many wonderful moments in my life. That was certainly one of them, because we had been working on these regulations really from 74 till 77 just to get them out and have them have the force and effect of law was a pretty wonderful moment.
It's a huge, tremendous beginning. It's really a leap forward for us.
The momentum that evolved in that short period of time demonstrated to us our strength, demonstrated to us also, I think, our growing political sophistication, our ability to negotiate, our ability to play hardball. People didn't really know what to do with us.
Most people, a little latecomers, think Justin was the granddaddy of the movement. He actually came in a little later, and he immersed himself and then became a prominent player through his involvement in Republican politics.
So you had this guy, Justin Dart, who could speak to many of the Republican leaders.
His father had been part of the kitchen cabinet in the Reagan White House and was very involved politically.
When Justin called and told me that they were looking for a director for the National Council on the Handicapped and he would like for me to apply for the job, I said, why? And he said, because you can do it. This was a council that was appointed by President Reagan. He appointed people who thought like him to that council. They were business people by and large, and they would not have thought of suggesting to the president that there be a civil rights law.
Justin, he didn't really experience the same types of discrimination that many of us experienced, but he learned about it. And as he learned about it, he could articulate it. He could speak powerfully about it. So he had that ability to really gain support from a very broad set of constituencies.
Justin Dart was a guiding spirit. He understood the concept of process. He understood that we needed to take steps in educating the public, and the first step was educating the public of people with disabilities. So Justin himself went to all the 50 states, not once, not twice, but 3 or 4 times, meeting with groups of people with disabilities. And because of that, we were able to do the necessary research to present to the council what people with disabilities in America were saying about their lives and what was missing. It soon became clear that the principal need of people with disabilities in the United States in 1985 was for non-discrimination. And we had to make the recommendation that there be a law protecting the rights of people with disabilities.
Each human being has an inalienable right and an inalienable responsibility to govern their own life, to participate in government of their society, and to be maximally productive in terms of quality of life for themselves and for all of their fellow humans.
So he went around with his cowboy hat all around, and in so doing, became our beloved, almost spiritual leader.
You weren't paying, and we can't ride the bus. We can't ride the bus. Take it off. And you know what you can do with it. Get out of here. You get out. We're the people.
I believe in democracy. I believe that the people can change something. And you kind of look at your own life and say, well, okay, if black people can get that law, how come I can't? So it's visionary, but it really is personal. It's like, okay, so why them and not me?
In the philosophy of community integration, we didn't want separate paratransit. We wanted, for people to be able to go to the bus stop like everybody else and get on a bus.
My job was to organize demonstrations. A bunch of us got out of our wheelchairs and just sat there. And the police, I mean, again, they were like, you know, oh no. And so going to jail or having that mentality that we're going to be arrested was, you know, part of the strategy, and it felt really good.
Disabled people feel that there is nothing else that we can do at this point but come to the streets and show the American public why we need their support and how we have a right to be able to work and raise families and get on and off the bus and on and off trains like everybody else. And that's what this is all about. We are members of society, and we...
Who could argue with the notion that public transportation should be for the public and people with disabilities should have access to whatever the public has access to?
And San Francisco police officers did what they had to do today, arrest the demonstrators for blocking public access. 76 were taken in, and police did that as gently as they could.
So just think about it. It wasn't paratransit, it wasn't aircraft, it wasn't steamboats, trains. It was access to mainline buses. Now that's very narrow, but we stayed focused on that.
I don't know where they got room.
What that evolved to was access as a civil right, which then permeated the work and the advocacy for the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
We deaf people have our right, and now the time that we need a deaf person. We don't want one, we need one.
Gallaudet, the community, the people came to realize, you know, it's our turn. We really have the same rights and the same abilities and the same potentials as other people. Let's stand up.
All deaf people and those hearing people who are truly concerned owe Gallaudet students a debt of gratitude for insisting that our time is now.
So in the case of Gallaudet, where you have a university for deaf people, the failure to have a deaf person running that organization leads one to believe that there is no qualified deaf person who can run an institution of that size.
The students will have to be a little quieter.
So you've got to change that.
We wanted to make sure that the board understood and heard us. But, well, they thought it would be better for us. They thought that their judgment was superior to ours. You know, we're doing this for you because we know better, because you're disabled and you're deaf. It was a very paternalistic attitude, and we said, no, that's not what we want. We can do a good job. We can do it very well, thank you. And that's when they made that decision, and they essentially ignored us.
We must have a superior president who will be able to inspire and motivate and lead a superior faculty, and that is why we voted that way.
The woman who had been named president, when she saw what was going on and when she correctly recognized it as a civil rights issue and not just a protest, she stepped down.
I am thrilled to accept the invitation of the Board of Trustees to become the president of Gallaudet University.
But what's interesting is it didn't just stop there. It went beyond that. It went beyond the borders of the deaf community. There were articles written about Gallaudet protests all over the world.
Key leaders told me how important the success of the revolution was to help shepherd ADA through committee and through the House and Senate.
We had a vision. We expected to change the world. We had a compelling need and we had a compelling story. You know, if you have a good story, it's not hard to get people to watch it or listen to it. That's what we had. We had 52 million people with disabilities who were disenfranchised in America, the country that prides itself on equality. And we had an answer to that problem.
Disabled Americans must become full partners in America's Opportunity Society.
He was a compassionate conservative. Nobody knew what that meant. So they ran around trying to find a piece of legislation to show what he was a compassionate conservative about. And so they came up with the ADA. And that's how he actually endorsed it.
Now, the first version we introduced, that Lowell Weicker and I introduced, was sort of the pie in the sky. We wanted everything. We knew we were going to have to compromise on it.
There were a number of provisions in the bill that were going to go nowhere.
We realized that to really be taken seriously, we had to pare it down considerably. And there ensued, probably starting around January of '89, very intensive meetings with all the disability groups.
Now, there were some in the disability community say, how can you compromise from the word go? Our strategy, accepted by Justin, Pat Wright, and a number of others, was to let's have a bill that we can defend.
The Act has the potential to become one of the great civil rights laws of our generation. Disabled citizens deserve the opportunity to work for a living, ride a bus, have access to public and commercial buildings, and to do all the other things that the rest of us take for granted.
I am concerned. I'm concerned about what I think may put some people out of business.
Well, the big beef that came from the business community was this was going to be incredibly expensive. It was going to make American businesses less competitive worldwide, and we had to rebut those as best we could.
I've known John Sununu for quite a while, and so I call up John. I have a understanding with the president that anytime I had difficulties, that I should call him. And so I'm going to have to call him if I can't get this bill by you. And he says, I know your agreement with the president, but I'm going to make you call him. I said, why would you do that? He said, I'm just opposed to the bill. I think it's wrong, just not appropriate for the government to be involved in, and I'm totally against it. So you're going to have to call him, and he's going to have to tell me that he supports it, and I'm going to make you do it. And he'll tell me. You'll call him, he'll tell me, but he's going to have to do it. I said, okay, I will.
Shortly after that, we had a meeting here in the Capitol. It was called together by Senator Kennedy. Small meeting. We sat across the table. John Sununu was bringing up all the objections to this bill. Well, you know, I have this apartment on the second floor and this and that. He had all these examples, to which Bobby Silverstein, my counsel, would say, well, sir, I'm sorry, but that does not apply to this. This happened one more time. Bobby Silverstein said something, and Sununu started yelling at him. He started yelling at Bobby Silverstein is sitting next to me. I'm sitting here, Bobby's sitting here, and Kennedy is sitting right next to me. Sununu's right across the table. He starts yelling at Bobby Silverstein. Yelling at him. Kind of just shook everybody. Started yelling at him about, every time I say something, you're contradicting it. I said, you're just a staff person, and this and that. I don't want to hear from you anymore. And just really went after Bobby. In my mind, I'm thinking, what's my response going to be when Kennedy, next to me, stands up, throws his chair back, leans across the table, smacked his hand on the table loud enough to be heard halfway across the Capitol, took his finger, put it right in John Sununu's face and said, you don't yell at our staff. You want to yell at somebody, you yell at me. He works on my committee. You want to yell at, you yell at me. Come on, you want to yell at me? You come on, yell. You don't yell at my staff. Don't you ever do that in my presence. So you want to yell, you come on, you yell at me right now. Sununu just got pale. Blood just drained from his face. I mean, Kennedy's veins were popping out. I thought he was going to grab him by the throat. I mean, Kennedy was furious. His Irish temper, my God. I mean, we're all just, I really did think he was going to grab Sununu. All of a sudden, John Sununu became irrelevant.
What do you want? ADA! When do you want
they had gotten it through one of the houses real quickly, and then it stalled. And only when it stalled did they think that, well, maybe we did need some more aggressive type action because our political lobbying just wasn't working. I mean, we were sort of the crazy ant in the attic.
Bob Kafka called me. He said, Senator, he says, better be watching TV tonight. And I said, why? I said, watch the news. He said, we're going to help you get your bill. We're going to help you. I said, all right, what are you guys doing?
The night before, they asked for volunteers to, crawl up the steps, And I thought it was a great idea. Some people were really against it. They thought that it would be really demeaning to see a bunch of disabled people crawling up steps, But my feeling on it was that it was really demeaning the way the country was treating disabled people anyway.
We're going to march until Congress starts listening to us. They're stalling the bill that's going to give us equal rights, and we aren't asking for civil rights. We're demanding them, and now.
So why not let them see some reality? See what people have to do in order to get to the top of the building, I just remember the night before, just all these ideas going through my head, like all the years of fighting for disability rights, all the meetings. And it was this big moment where I was going to be able to release all this energy by crawling up these steps. I probably about the same weight I am now, so I'm not in that great a shape, so there's 100 steps, And there was this little girl, was right ahead of me, And I said, oh my gosh, this little girl she has cerebral palsy. This little girl is gonna climb up the steps ahead of me, and I'm not gonna be able to make it. And she's gonna make me look really stupid,
Hey, come on, Jennifer. Hey, come on, girl.
I'll take all night if I have to.
So of course the cameras were on her, but they were on me right below her, so I couldn't stop,
As a matter of fact, several senators were furious because look at those folks. They're obstructing, they're in our way, they're making fools of themselves and so forth. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Because it inconvenienced these senators. You know what? This was the way our people lived every day. And they were inconvenienced for a few moments. Pardon me. It had the impact. It had the social impact that we wanted.
That made national news. National news. And it was one of the things that really brought home to senators and congressmen what we were trying to do.
Well, they didn't pass the ADA. It didn't come out of committee. So we went to what we thought was the next necessary to, again, keep the focus on the issue. Now we were going to go right to the seat of power, right in the rotunda of the Capitol.
Why is it that the House of Representatives can't get their act together and get this thing passed?
Well, as a matter
We've been
of fact,
waiting, wait a minute. We have been waiting a whole year for this. The Senate, 200 years, the Senate has passed it, the President has endorsed it, our time has come, pass this bill now. Our goal was to spend as much time there as it took for them to commit to sign the ADA. And my board of directors was really cool. They said, we don't mind if you get arrested. The only thing we ask that you have a tie on, a nice shirt and a tie, because you are representing the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. So if there were any pictures of me, they didn't want me in any tie-dye t-shirts or anything like that. The person kept thinking I was in charge of the group. I was there to support them. This woman came up to me. She must have been about 20 or 21. I'll never forget this in my whole life. And she said, "Oh, I'm so excited." You know, this was in the rotunda. And I said, "Well, what are you excited about?" She said, "Oh, they told me that there was going to be a group of handicapped people and I'm supposed to give them a tour, you know." And I said, "You're going to give them a tour?" I said, "Oh, really?" I said, I have to tell you something. I don't think these people are here for a tour." I said, "Don't worry, you're going to be part of the history today. Don't worry about the tour."
It's going to pass the House of Representatives overwhelmingly.
If the United States government is not prepared to give us our civil rights, then the United States government will have to arrest us and carry us out of the building.
But I'm not sure.
And finally, you know, people start bringing out their chains and locking themselves up, you know.
Excuse me, could you help with this chain?
Chain it around his neck and through the chair. Seriously.
They chained all the wheelchairs together, and some people chained their bodies to each other. And the police were just going berserk. They didn't know what to do. And then they were trying to lift people, and then these heavy motorized wheelchairs, they were putting the brakes on, so you couldn't push them by themselves. It was great, you know. That was the moment where Congress decided to act on the ADA.
In sign language, I just wanted to say to my brother Frank that today was my proudest day in 16 years in Congress. That today Congress opens the doors to all Americans with disabilities. That today we say no to fear, that we say no to ignorance, and that we say no to prejudice. The ADA is indeed the 20th Century Emancipation Proclamation for all Americans with disabilities. Today, the U.S. Senate will say to all Americans that the days of segregation and inequality are over.
Many of us have been in touch with those with disabilities. My sister Rosemary, retarded, son who lost a leg to cancer. And others who support this legislation believe in it. But I cannot be unmindful of the extraordinary contributions of those who have been lucky enough to either have members of their families or children who are facing some challenges and know what this legislation means.
On the day Bush signed the ADA, we convinced him that we should make it a great big celebration.
I sat with Senator Kennedy in the 89th row back or something like that. And Kennedy leaned over to me and he said, Pat, I said, "Yes, Senator. What happens if he reads the bill before he signs it?" I said, "Don't worry, he won't." I mean, the senator knew that nobody really understood the impact of what this piece of legislation was going to do. And we were all afraid that somebody was going to read it before it was signed into law, but luckily nobody did.
Well, it was a glorious day, July 26, 1990. 3,000 or 4,000 people, many with disabilities and their families, on the south lawn of the White House.
Never been that many people there for a signing of a bill before. Biggest group ever in the history of this country.
Here were people who had worked on this for years and years and years. The president can sign it without owning it. This president decided he was going to own it, and that made a big difference.
I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disability Act and say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
Having been told for so long how powerless we were, and here we were with the President of the United States signing this document that was our Emancipation Proclamation.
I had the sense that the moment was one that I would never forget, that there was a ceremony, and the ceremony was very important, but the moment was much more than that. The moment was a recognition of the rights and abilities of people with disabilities, a recognition of the end of discrimination against people with disabilities, and the spirit of that, the feeling, the whole crowd, was that in American Sign Language there's a sign for that, and the sign is, it's called PA. PA, that's how you make a sound when you sign it, PA. And that was a PA day. That was the day that you guys saw us as your peers and not as someone who needed your help.
The development of true discrimination takes decades and centuries. I don't believe that discrimination easily ends just because we've been able to get pieces of legislation passed. This fight of ending discrimination in the area of disability is one that will continue to go on for decades.
I think the future is the revolution that empowers every single human being on a custom basis. And I think it's the next step for humanity that is necessary to move from the last stages of barbarism into a golden age of science and democracy. We're not going to have science and democracy until each person is empowered to live their God-given potential. And it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen when we make it happen.